Many thanks, Gary. Startling statistics, but also great images. I'm looking forward to the Please Fire Me as a tattoo. And also, it's very nice to see that Conchita Wurst made it into your poster of Men Can Do It. So anyway, we're now going to move on to Michael Kimmel. Michael, your work has focused on men and masculinities in the US, but as we clearly see, there's absolutely no American exceptionalism when it comes to the situation of men and women in the US. Can you give us your take on the global condition?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Great. Now you can. I'm really honored to be here and quite inspired. Inspired, in fact, by the work that so many of you do as I've been meeting people over the past couple of days. And I want to give you a little bit of a slightly different take. Part of what I want to talk about is how we bring men into this conversation in the first place. I want to talk about the entry of men into this conversation. So, because this is a particularly important thing for me. I'm both a professor and an activist. I've had my whole career, I've been both an academic and an activist. And as such, temperamentally, I'm an optimist. Because as an activist, I have to believe that change is possible. And as a professor, I have to believe that, or I do believe, that if I can inspire my students to engage more critically with their world, their lives will be better for it. So those are both very optimistic postures. So for me, the temptation will be, you'll have to pull me back from that optimism needs to be tempered with a bit of realism, lest it become naive. So, and I'm aware of this, but but being optimistic, I go around to universities and corporations in the United States, and I try to get men to take the first step into the feminist conversation. I try to get them to take that first step. How do we get them in? So I work with fraternities, for example, or I work with athletic teams, or I work with regular college students. I work with rather resistant men in corporations. All of this to try and bring men into the conversation. So what I want to do today is I want to talk for a couple of minutes about some of the obstacles that I confront bringing men into this conversation, and then talk a little bit about how men might engage. Now, you saw in the title of this session that it was the state of the Men for Equality field. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about all three of those words, men for equality. I'm going to talk about how we talk about men. I'm going to talk about what the word equality means when men hear it for the first time or begin to engage with it. And then I'm going to talk about the idea of how we get them to actually commit to support gender equality. What are the ways that we do that? What are the baby steps that men can take into this conversation? So let me start with the word men. Here I think we face a particular obstacle, at least in the US, and that is that one of the most important changes throughout the world in the past 50 years is very simple. Women made gender visible. We now know that gender is one of the organizing principles of social life. We now know that gender is one of the foundations of your identity. Let me tell you, in the US, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, if you went to graduate school and said, I want to study gender, there was not one course you could take. In fact, in my field, I'm a sociologist. 50 years ago, if you said you wanted to study women, there was one course you could take. It was marriage and the family. For years, that was like the ladies' auxiliary of social science. Today, of course, there's women's studies courses, gender studies courses on every campus in the United States. But when I say the word gender, what gender do we think of? Most, we think of women. You teach a course like Psychology of Women, you get 95% women. Teach a course called Psychology of Gender, you get 90% women. Most men don't know that gender is as important to us as women understand it is to them. Most men don't know that gender even matters. Most men don't even know they have a gender. Gender remains invisible to men, and this is political. In fact, I'll tell you my own story of how I first began to think about this. This is a story that takes place 30 years ago and will be so obviously, it would be very obvious to you that it could not possibly happen today. But when I was in graduate school 30 years ago, a bunch of us got together one day, and some of you may know, graduate students, they get all excited about like these strange ideas that are just coming out. And a bunch of us got together 30 years ago, and somebody said, there is an explosion of writing and thinking in feminist theory, but there's no courses yet. So we did what graduate students typically do. We said, okay, let's have a study group. We'll get together once a week, we'll read a text, we'll talk about it, we'll have a potluck. So every week, 11 women and me got together, and we would read a text in feminist theory and talk about it. And during one of our meetings, I witnessed a conversation between two women that changed everything for me. One of the women was white, and one was black. And the white woman said, this is the part that's going to sound really anachronistic, I promise. The white woman said, all women face the same oppression as women. All women are similarly situated in patriarchy, and therefore, all women have a kind of intuitive solidarity or sisterhood. Right. And the black woman said, I'm not so sure. Let me ask you a question. So the black woman says to the white woman, when you wake up in the morning and you look in the mirror, what do you see? And the white woman said, I see a woman. And the black woman said, you see, that's the problem. When I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror, she said, I see a black woman. To me, race is visible. But to you, race is invisible. You don't see it. And then she said something really startling. She said, that's how privilege works. It is a luxury, I would say, to white people sitting in this room not to have to think about race every split second of our lives. Privilege is invisible to those who have it. Now, so, of course, we all heard this, and you remember I was the only man in this group. So when I heard this, I kind of groaned, and I put my head in my hand. I said, oh, no. And someone said, well, what was that reaction? And I said, well, when I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror, I see a human being. I'm kind of the generic person. Yeah, I'm a middle-class white man. I have no race, no class, no gender. I'm universally generalizable. So I like to think that was the moment that I became a middle-class white man. That class and race and gender were not about other people, but they were about me, and I had to start thinking about them. I wish I could tell you that this story ends 30 years ago in that little discussion group, but I was reminded of it quite recently. At my university, I have a female colleague, and we both teach the Sociology of Gender course. So when it's my turn to teach it, my colleague comes to give a guest lecture for me. When it's her turn to teach it, I go to give a guest lecture for her. So recently, I walk into her class to give a guest lecture. 350 students in the room. I walk in, and one of the students looks up at me and goes, oh, finally, an objective opinion. All that semester, every single time my colleague opened her mouth, what my students saw was a woman. Phumzile, if you were to stand up in front of my students and say, there is structural inequality based on gender, they would say, well, of course you'd say that. You're a woman. You're biased. When I say it, they go, wow, that's interesting. Is that going to be on the test? How do you spell structural? So look, I hope everybody up in the balcony can see, this is what objectivity looks like. Disembodied Western rationality. So the first thing that we have to say so our first obstacle, this is the word men, our first obstacle then is we must make gender visible to men. This is a political strategy because if we make gender visible, we by definition make privilege visible. And that leads me to my second obstacle to bringing men into this conversation, and that's the word equality. Because when you start to present privilege to white men in America, their reaction is often, what are you talking about? When we used to say in the 1970s, men have the power, men have to give up the power, men would say, what are you talking about? I don't have any power. My wife bosses me around. My kids boss me around. My boss bosses me around. I'm powerless. So the language of giving up power failed to resonate for many men. But I was thinking about this just recently. I was on a TV talk show opposite four men. You all know the talk show. You know, black female host comes from Chicago. You probably have seen her many times. Just academics don't make very good talk show guests typically. You know, because the talk show format is very polarized. Yes, no, us, them, black, white. And what do academics do? We get up and go, well, it's a little more complicated than that. You know, and which is, let's face it, bad TV. So I was on this show opposite four white men who claimed that they were the victims of reverse discrimination, also known as affirmative action, that they were qualified for jobs and promotions which they did not get, and they were really angry. In fact, this was where I derived the term angry white men for the book, for my most recent book. And the reason I'm telling you this story is these guys, the title of this particular show was a quote from one of these men. And the quote was, "A black woman stole my job." And these guys all told their story. They were qualified for jobs, qualified for promotion. They didn't get it, and boy, were they angry. So then it was my turn, and I said, I just have one question for you guys. It's a question about the title, "A Black Woman Stole My Job." Actually, it's a question about one word in the title. I want to know about the word "my." Where did you get the idea it was your job? Why isn't the title of the show "A Black Woman Got a Job" or "A Black Woman Got the Job"? Because without confronting men's sense of entitlement, we will never understand why so many men resist gender equality. Look, we think this is a level playing field. You know, so any policy that tilts it even a little bit, we think, oh my God, water's rushing uphill, it's reverse discrimination against us. Let's be clear. White men in North America and Europe are the beneficiaries of the single greatest affirmative action program in the history of the world. It is called the history of the world. So our second test, and now I've described two obstacles to bringing men in to the conversation about gender equality. That gender is invisible, and that sense of entitlement leads men to believe erroneously that gender equality is a zero-sum game, and if women win, men are going to lose. So part of our task then is to make a different case. So now I'm going to talk about men as they first begin to step into the space of the feminist conversation about gender equality. And once they're there, we have, in fact, we heard this last night from Rahul Bose, who said it's not just a matter of getting men there, they have to be there for the right reasons. Now, of course, we all know what the right reason is. The right reason is what we would call the ethical imperative. It's right, it's fair, it's just. That does not motivate men. It's right, it's fair, it's just, it's true. But it doesn't get men motivated. Here's another way that men often enter this space, I think erroneously. We come in kind of as the cavalry. Thank you so much for bringing this to our attention, ladies. We'll take it from here. That leads men to declare themselves heroes a little bit too quickly, engaging in what I have come to call premature self-congratulation. So that's another motive, the rescue motive, the protector-provider motive. But I think there's a third way that we can bring men into this conversation. And you heard it actually alluded to in Gary's speech as well. And that is, we have to be able to show men that gender equality is in their interests as men. And that happily, I'm happy to say, all of the research seems to suggest exactly that. The research says it's not a zero-sum game, but rather a win-win. And I'll just give you one bit of one example, and it's exactly what Gary was talking about care work. Some sociological research from the United States found, now I'm going to try to get men now to sign up, to be motivated, right? So here's what the data show. When men share housework and childcare, this is research-based. When men share housework and childcare, their children do better in school. When men share housework and childcare, their children have lower rates of absenteeism, are less likely to see child therapists, are less likely to be diagnosed with depression, less likely to be put on prescription medication, and less likely to be absent. They have higher rates of achievement. So their children are happier, healthier, and do better in school. Okay, maybe that's not enough of a motivation for men. When men share housework and childcare, their wives are happier. Duh. But their wives are also healthier. Their wives are less likely to go to therapists, be diagnosed with depression, or take prescription medication. Their wives are more likely to remain fit. So when men share housework and childcare, their wives are happier, healthier, and also report higher levels of marital satisfaction. All right, maybe that's not enough of a motivation for men. When men share housework and childcare, the men are happier and healthier. The men smoke less, drink less, take recreational drugs less often. They are more likely to go to doctors for routine screenings, less likely to go to the emergency room. They are less likely to see therapists, be diagnosed with depression, take prescription medication. So when men share housework and childcare, the men are happier and healthier. Okay, maybe that's not enough of a motivation for men. The fourth finding is when men share housework and childcare, they have more sex. Now, of these four very interesting findings, which one do you think Men's Health magazine put on its cover? Housework makes her horny, was what it said. Obviously not when she does it. Now, for the men in the room, let me be very clear about this. These data are derived over a really long period of time. So I don't want any of the men in the room to think that I'm going to go home and do the dishes tonight. A really long period of time. Okay. So what's my point then is that I believe that we can engage men, we can bring men, we have the rest of their lives to make things more complicated. But we have to get men into the room. We have to figure out ways to engage men, to let them know that this conversation is, in fact, about them, too. We know, as Punzile said, we know that empowering women and girls requires that we also engage men and boys. This is a way to start the conversation. It's not the end of the conversation. I told you at the beginning that I was optimistic. And here's one of the reasons that I'm so optimistic. Because this was on my son, who's 15. This was on his Facebook page 2 weeks ago. Do you remember that? Have you seen the Tumblr campaign against the anti-feminist Tumblr campaign called "Why I Don't Need Feminism"? So my son decided he was going to engage with this. So he writes, "I need feminism because it's easy to ignore sexism when it works in your favor." So that's why I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because I know when I work with young men that they have the desire and they have the ability to enter this conversation for the first time in large numbers. I believe we can do that together. So to conclude, I just want to say one thing. Those of you who, and that is about where we go from here. In your conference bag, there's this wonderful magazine, Voicemail Magazine. And on the back cover of it, it was supposed to be a separate insert, but I apologize, it didn't get here in time. But on the back cover of it, we have an announcement about the conference that is going to be the next conference in this conversation, which will be in New York City, right before CSW, March 5th to 8th, that we, the Center for the Study of Men and Masculinities, partnered with UN Women, partnered with Men Engage, will be hosting. And the conference really is going to be a conversation between researchers and activists to move this dialogue forward. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Michael, for the terrific insights. Ironing as foreplay, who would have thought? Anyway, I'm going to call on Vivek. It's great to have someone from our host country. Vivek is going to give us his personal but also professional reflections on the intersection of gender and sexual rights and men and gender equality.
Oh, thanks, Shireen. So I'm going to ask you to put yourselves in my shoes for a second. I was married, I was respectable, I was holding a good job in the legal profession. We were double income with a kid. We had an apartment we could call our own, all the stuff of the modern Indian dream. A car, a vacation a year, all the gadgetry you could want, flat screen LED TV, iPhone, iPad, iPod. I was settled apparently. She was a dentist with a thriving practice of her own. We originated from middle-class, mid-sized town India, lived in the big city. Marriage was a rite of passage. What does a marriage need, I wondered. And I guessed respect, honesty, loyalty, nurturing, dialogue, passion. I failed on almost every one of those counts from the outset. And she could sense some of that a few months down the road. But a child would resolve the hiccups. No, I knew a child wouldn't. To myself, I said that a child would be the worst possible idea. But I went through the motions. We became parents. They were initially the happiest times, but soon enough they became the most tortuous times for me. I respected her, but had to act in a manner of disrespect, and I certainly couldn't be honest, loyal, nurturing, passionate, or able to dialogue. She eventually found out that I was attracted to other men. She revealed this to me while also revealing it to the authorities with evidence. Before the evidence was revealed, I wholeheartedly denied any such attraction. After all, I was a man, chief caretaker of the abode, of a wife and child, beer-drinking backslapper, sports fiend, automobile lover, fiercely aggressive at times when aspersions were cast on any member of my family. I was a man in all these overt ways. I was also a man in a multitude of other ways that I dared not exhibit. Lover of art, of the Bollywood tearjerker, connoisseur of fashion and jewelry, of men's hands and men's necks, of fine wine and TV cooking shows, of Umrao Jan circa 1981 and Pakiza, of pastel-colored shirts, of the male form of other men. There was no way that this was going to be revealed until it all unraveled in a police case for the world and the media, which called me weird, to see. I was emasculated. There's no more precise way of putting it. I was made to feel less of a man, not a man at all. And of course, an obfuscating criminal. Needless to say, lives have been wrecked. So this is not actually my story. I'll come to that. But as many of you in the audience from India may have read recently, in essence, although with some crucial differences, it is the real-life situation of two human beings in Bangalore. It's come to this for several reasons. One reason is an entrenched unacceptability of sexuality diversity by some in Indian society, although far from all. There are a few words that can be used to describe this: intolerance, homophobia. Another is an entrenched but random notion of what it is to be a man or a woman in society. And consequently, this social ossification has led to so much self-hatred among many people with non-normative sexualities and gender expressions about their innate differences, whether they feel a same-sex attraction, or a dissonance between their sex and their gender, or the simple comfort in dressing differently from the norm. And of course, as we have witnessed in this country in the last year, the so-called justice system has played its part in shocking insensitivity in understanding the eloquent human cry from emancipation by people like me, queer, lesbian, gay, homosexual, bisexual, whatever you want to call us, whatever we want to call ourselves, to rid ourselves of a ridiculous, archaic law. And to what end all of this? To destroy the lives of people who are different, diverse, not conforming to femininity or masculinity as per social norms, all because of concerns of izzat and abru, of honor and reputation. A little bit about myself now. I'm here not as an expert on masculinity or gender equality, certainly not in the academic, intellectual sense. But I have lived 44 years, and that should count for something. I suppose I'm an expert by just being. by having a mother, a sister, nieces, girl and women friends who've experienced how the world turns based on their gender, their masculinity, their femininity, their gender roles, and being aware, conscious, open to understanding the experiences they've had. By observing the way in which men I know deal with women, their own manhood, their gender privilege, and how I as a man will deal with these too. So it's not rocket science. I think that if each of us put our minds to it, we can all be experts in masculinity and gender equality. But I also consider myself an expert by having lived with my queerness, my difference, although that may not be apparent. You would be all too familiar with the stereotype, and outwardly I probably tick all the boxes of what it is to be a man and the assumptions that come with it. Unemotional, composed, confident, mainstream in appearance and gait, sporty, although that's in the past tense. I pass as a heterosexual all the time. I may be some of these things sometimes and other times not. Yet I'm several other things too. With a worldview which has been deeply informed by realizing in my early teens that I was attracted to men, I envision many things differently from conventional wisdom, including gender roles within the home and in public life, the possibilities of how family can be defined, how sexuality can manifest itself in outward appearances and inner desires, in personal